So, a lot has been made about how liberals tend to have something called pathological altruism. And I think there is some truth to it. Like a lot of liberals will bend over backwards to show how much they're willing to give up to supposedly help other people. Like, for instance, bringing in as many immigrants as possible, even if these immigrants are people who likely will have high crime rates or won't be able to contribute much to the economy, or in many cases won't have jobs at all, and will be on welfare and things like that. Or, for instance, in other cases with COVID, where they're all so eager to signal how willing they are to stay at home all the time, to give up doing everything fun that they ever enjoyed doing outside of the house, just to prove how much they're willing to step up to stop more people from getting COVID. And whether or not they're actually motivated by a genuine sense of altruism or by a desire to be socially accepted for signaling their virtue, I mean, does it necessarily make a difference? Regardless of what their core motive is, there is a certain sense of pathological altruism that does exist among them. And it's a very irrational sense of altruism. It's this idea like, we always have to help out the most vulnerable people no matter what, even if it actually ends up dragging everyone down in the process. Now, that is very much true, but I want to talk about the opposite phenomenon, which is something I've noticed among many right-wingers, including alt-right, mainstream right, libertarians, basically anyone within the broader right-wing sphere. And that is pathological individualism. Now, the interesting thing about pathological individualism is that it's actually different from being pathologically selfish. Because pathological selfishness might actually be better in some ways, because sometimes doing the selfish thing is actually very different from asserting yourself constantly as an individual. In some ways, you would actually be benefiting yourself more by doing the collectivist thing than by doing the individualist thing. So pathological individualism, it actually goes beyond self-interest. It goes beyond selfishness. It's all about asserting yourself as an individual no matter what, even if it actually ends up hurting you more than it helps you. Now, it's essentially about always asserting your independence, being like, I'm not part of the crowd, I'm not part of the collective, I'm an individual, nobody else matters but me. I'm always looking out for number one, no matter what, even if it actually hurts me in the end, even if I would actually benefit more from engaging in more pro-social behavior, in behavior that's more in tune with what would be better for the community or the collective. I'm actually going to be so individualistic that I'll do it even when it actually hurts myself. Now, what are some examples of pathological individualism among right-wingers? I could give a few examples. And again, like, I'm not trying to say all right-wingers are like this, but at the same time, it is a common thread I've noticed among many. So what would be some examples? The first example, quite possibly the biggest, is the refusal to pay taxes. And this is something I've seen among right-wingers, even who call themselves like Nazbols or National Socialists. There's like this huge aversion toward paying taxes. And they claim it's because our present government wastes money, but to be honest, judging by their rhetoric, I feel like they would do the same under any government, because they say stuff like taxation is theft, and they use arguments about like how paying taxes is inherently unjust. But the reason why they're actually hurting themselves is because if nobody pays taxes, you're going to live in a shithole society. You're going to live in basically a third world country with shit infrastructure, shit social services, just shit everything. And I think a lot of these people are so pathologically individualistic that they are willing to actually suffer as an individual for the sake of not paying taxes or not paying hardly any taxes, because they're so desperate to assert themselves as individuals in that way. Another example of pathological individualism is, say, for instance, the desire to be able to do whatever you want, even when it hurts yourself. For instance, when it comes to like drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, the desire to like, oh, I should be able to do whatever drugs I want, wherever I want, etc. It's like, even if you're hurting yourself by doing this and you'd be better off avoiding this kind of behavior, it's something that is part of pathological individualism, because it's all about, I have to assert my individuality, I have to assert my free choice no matter what, even when it hurts me. And it's funny how the free choice always has to be the one that's kind of perceived as the antisocial choice. It's never like, oh, I'm a free individual, I'm going to assert my individuality by doing something pro-social. It's always like, no, I have to assert my individuality by snorting cocaine. I have to assert my individuality by smoking cigarettes all the time, everywhere, including indoors, in public places. So that would be another example. Another example is the obsession with driving cars everywhere and living in suburbia, in low-density suburbia. They are so willing to assert their individuality in that case that they just hate public transit, even in cases where it makes a lot more sense. Even in places where you have good public transit. Even, frankly, like, if the weather's really shitty and it's kind of not safe to drive, they always want to drive everywhere because it's a way of asserting their individuality. It's like, I'm me, I'm myself, I control my car, I drive the steering wheel, I move the steering wheel, I'm in control. It's this obsession with being in control. And it's like, to the point where even if they're in a situation where public transit actually makes more sense to use, they'll still drive for that reason. It's all about asserting their individuality. And it's also, frankly, bullshit, because it's like, no, as a car driver, you're not really a rugged individual. You depend on the oil companies for your gasoline. You depend on the car company to build and manufacture your car. You depend on auto mechanics to repair it. But nevertheless, they perceive themselves as rugged individuals for driving everywhere, and especially for driving in an SUV or a pickup truck or some big vehicle like that. And of course, this is something that auto companies have strategically been using to sell cars to people. This idea that cars are a symbol of individuality, of asserting yourself. And they do it to both men and women. Like this idea, like, I'm a big, strong man with my pickup truck, or I'm a big, strong, independent woman with my crossover SUV. It's all about this, like, I'm independent, I do what the fuck I want, I'm the big cheese, I'm the big fucking kahuna. It's all about that. And really, I do see some pathological individualism in the attitudes of mostly right-wingers who engage in this kind of behavior. And it's the same with suburbia. It's like living in really, really sprawled neighborhoods, even when it actually hurts you in some ways, because it means you have to like drive really long distances to get anywhere. And it means you have this big, huge fucking lawn to mow, this huge driveway to shovel when it snows, raking tons of leaves, all this constant yard maintenance, vacuuming, like this huge house to vacuum, but you don't care, because it's like, even though you waste so much time doing this shit, time that could be better spent on other things, you have to assert yourself as an individual by having the biggest fucking house. So that's what I mean by pathological individualism. And I mean, I guess you could say on some level a little bit with like the refusal to wear masks with COVID. Although in that case, I think it's a bit more debatable, because I'm starting to think with this Omicron variant, maybe herd immunity is the best strategy. So like, okay, with COVID, it's more debatable whether pathological individualism is a factor with some of the more like extreme people. Like, again, I've said many times, I'm against all these closures. I'm against all the lockdowns, the shutdowns, and all that shit. I'm 100% against it. However, I will say, for people who like, they won't even wear a mask if they're in like a crowded elevator or like a really, really crowded indoor public place, I do question, it's like, to some extent, are they putting their own individuality ahead of their own well-being? Maybe. They might be. Although, like the desire to assert their individuality comes ahead of their actual self-interest. But at the same time, it's like you could argue maybe COVID with this Omicron variant is becoming less dangerous, and thus maybe herd immunity is actually the better strategy. I don't actually know at this point. I'm just saying, at least early on during the pandemic, I do think there was definitely an element of pathological individualism among some of the more extreme anti-maskers and stuff like that. But again, like, there's also obviously a hell of a lot of pathological altruism among the extremely pro-lockdown people, especially the pro-lockdown people who aren't elderly or severely immunocompromised themselves. So it's like both ends of the spectrum. But again, I must emphasize there's a difference between pathological individualism and pathological selfishness. To be honest, pathological selfishness would actually be a better principle than pathological individualism, because a lot of the time, a person's true self-interest and society's self-interest, not all the time, but often align. Whereas where individualism diverts from self-interest, it's often something that is harmful both to the individual and to society at large. Like, as I've said in all these aforementioned examples. So yeah, that's basically what I am terming pathological individualism. It's kind of the mirror image of pathological altruism on the right.